I'm Claire Parker.
And I'm Ashley Hamilton.
And this is Celebrity Memoir Book Club,
the podcast where we are down in the basement, scrounging through the tracks, laying some groundwork, and going on tour with whatever we've got.
No. Your rights are rescinded.
We're writing a song based on a thing that we saw, and that song is a podcast.
We read the book so that you don't have to. And we will give you the rundown, and our opinions are going to come with it. And we totally respect and understand if you don't love that about us. But we beg you, just listen to a different podcast. Don't ask us to fundamentally change what it is that we do.
Yeah.
And of course, if you like what we do, we read and thank all of our 5-star reviewing wormies at the end of the episode. And then, of course, if you like what we do so much that you want to see us do stand-up, play games, do a celebrity essay live, and then engage and chat and debate the recents, come to our live shows. We've got 5 more shows this year. And then we are friggin' on hiatus like we were Sleater-Kinney in 2006 or some shit, you know?
Totally. So we are going to be in Austin, Texas on August 18th. April 18th is the date that I meant. And in May, we are coming to Columbus, Ohio, Charlotte, North Carolina, Tampa, Florida, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So if you live in or near one of those cities, we hope to see you there.
Of course, if you're like, I love what they think about these books, but what are they thinking about important topics like The Traitors, season 1 and 2 of The Traitors?
Like Vanderpump Rules, like things that we read around town, books, plays, articles. We've been into magazines lately. You can subscribe to our Patreon where we talk about stuff all the time, every Thursday.
And Ashley, if you were a celebrity and this week was your memoir chapter, what would its title be called?
It would be called Not Every Chapter Needs to Be a Chapter.
I feel like we've read this chapter before.
Well, when you're writing a chapter every week, it turns out you can skip a handful of them.
Fair enough. Listen, spoken like a true female memoirist. A man may say no, every moment matters, but a woman goes, I feel that I am on borrowed time here, so let me get to the good stuff.
Other than one beautiful day where it was like in the 60s, nothing happened to me.
Nice.
And the weather is important to me and it does affect me, but like, we don't need to talk about it. Claire, if you were to write a memoir about your life, what would you title last week's chapter?
In my failure era.
Uh-oh.
No, but in a positive way.
Oh.
Today, I took my first ceramics class.
Beautiful.
And my March challenge for myself is to get back on my fitness game. I really stopped working out the day after my wedding. And by day after, I mean, I guess the day before. I think like my last workout was September 8th. And since then, I've done 1 or 2 hot yogas. And I'm like, Claire, you got to get moving again. I also have been very much a homebody. I'm normally not so crazy about working out because I feel very active in New York City. I tend to walk and bike everywhere. Like, you know what I mean? I don't ever feel that stale. I've just been sitting in one spot feeling because I'm always moving and grooving and bopping and shaking. But I've definitely been sitting still for about 6 months now. And I was like, you got to get back on the horse. And we started. And today I just said, take it easy, a little 12-3-30, just an uphill stroll. Oh boy, we did a modified version.
It's hard.
Have you ever been like, we're going to ease our way into a walk? That was me this morning. And then I went to ceramics class and we each got like 3 balls of clay to start with.
I wonder if your arms are going to be sore from ceramics.
No, because much like my failed espresso learnings, they teach you how to not use your musculature, but your skeleton. They're like, it's a skeletal strength, not muscular strength. So you put your elbow right in your hip crease so you can be very still like blocks of wood.
That is so interesting. That is why you're getting a PhD and I'm not.
That's why you go to school, okay? So that you don't look like a fool, okay?
I would have sat there using all my might.
Idiots.
And guess how much might I have? A limited supply.
The bowl would have bowled you, okay? But we got 3 blocks of clay, and the first one I actually did what I thought was quite a lovely latte mug. And so that's pretty good. And then the lady said, well, then cut it off now. She goes, if you love it, stop before you mess it up. And I literally, the first that I had thought I had in my head was, am I allowed to love it? I was like, I think I love it, but is that allowed? And I told myself, no, you can't just like what you've come up with. And so then I fudged it up and it looked like, I really zoinked it. And then my next 2 attempts, I kept trying to recreate that mug I loved. And then something would happen and I'd go, okay, it's a plate now. And then I would keep fudging with it. And then I'd be like, okay, now it is stuck to it is a pile of clay that can't be fixed. And I did that twice in a row.
Yay.
And I just said, that's fine. We've got next week. And I got off the treadmill and I said, we'll walk again tomorrow. And it's fine. We're getting back out there. We're learning new tricks. And it's great to start off shitty because it just leaves you such heights to climb for later.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
I'm excited.
May we all fail at something this week because it only means the first step in a beautiful journey, I think.
And may we all learn to love a latte mug or ourselves.
Yeah.
Or both.
We all learn to give ourselves permission to say, do I love that? Yeah. You can love what you've done.
Speaking of loving your art, let's talk about Carrie Brownstein and her memoir, Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl. Normally we read the book so you don't have to, but I feel like you guys read the book and then requested over and over again for us to too.
Can I say, you guys know your goddamn audience because I did not see one request for this Carrie Brownstein book. And I wonder if people were going to you specifically. The way that like when I was little and I wanted to sleep in my parents' bed, I would skip my dad's side and go straight to my mom because I knew she was a sucker.
I think they knew like a rock chick would be kind of up my alley. And
oh my God, I thought you were going to call yourself a rock chick. I thought you were like, I think they knew that a rock chick would see the value in this book.
No, I think they know that I'm a poser who wishes I was Carrie Brownstein.
I'll say this, if you don't wish you were Carrie Brownstein, you're wrong.
I agree with that.
I put this book down and I go, well, I guess she's the coolest girl in the world. I want to say I'm not familiar with her music, and I've only seen one or two moments of Portlandia. Of all the music memoirs we've read, I think that this one is the best by far, and I wish I knew her music because I feel like if you were a fan of her in any capacity, well, musically, she does not talk about Portlandia here, even a second, but I feel like this is the memoir you're hoping everybody's going to write. It gives you more information and more tenderness and like more understanding. This is what a memoir addendum to music should be.
Yeah, I will be honest.
Okay.
Sleater-Kinney is not a band that I have delved deep into. I like some of their music. I actually like their music and I respect their music a lot. But listening to like a full album through the whole thing, it's like I don't listen to Radiohead albums all the way through really either because there are a lot of albums that like just get really heavy and intense. And that is sometimes not something I can deal with for a full amount of time. I was really excited to read this book because I like her a lot, but just for the records, I'm not like a Sleater-Kinney aficionado.
I think that's correct, though. It seems like they were writing music to make you go, okay, I give up. I can't anymore. You're right.
You guys are so good and you're so strong and
you're
so
too tough. Right? You're too tough and in the abyss by yourselves, and I'm not in that abyss with you, and I feel demolished by your work. Your art hurts me. I turn my back to you to represent the alienation of which you write. You win this time, Sleater-Kinney.
Yeah.
I will say, looking at a photo of this band, these three bitches, if you told me it was one girl, I would say yeah. They don't necessarily look alike, but if you only showed me one at a time, I'd say that was the same girl in three outfits. I couldn't tell you why they look different, but I know objectively that they do.
I think if they were sisters or cousins, I would say, of course.
If they were girls in my class, my dad would not be able to tell them apart.
I only wanted one thing on tour, to slam my hand in a door and break my fingers, then I would go home.
This is 2006. She had shingles on the right side of her body, brought on by stress. They'd been traveling, they're in Europe, and she just wanted to frickin' give up. On May 27th, my band, Sleater-Kinney, arrived in Brussels.
I will say, I'm going to trip over quotes in this book. It's written
like a lady who went to a writing class.
Totally. Tour reassembles you. It's a fragmentary and jarring existence, even without added illness or malady. But now I could not find the floor. I was outside the room, outside myself.
I was about to destroy Sleater-Kinney. I've always felt unclaimed. This is a story of the ways I created a territory, something more than just an archipelago of identities, something that could steady me, somewhere that I belonged. My story starts with me as a fan. And I love this. Something really interesting about this book is the way that she sees herself as like an outsider and a fan of all situations. So she has all these perspectives. And she has this way of being successful that is in no way condescending because she's like looking at her success through the lens of herself as a former fan. So she's very aware, but she's also like, I don't know, man, I was broken on the floor.
Yeah, I also think that she does such a good job of like acknowledging the intensity of her feelings in a situation while then from the future being like, there was a lot of like power to my feelings then, but also this isn't that important. Like the way she thinks about herself, being afraid to seem like a sellout or a poser or things like that. Like the way she talks about these moments and like her stubbornness or her timidness, I think it gives a lot of credit to those feelings while being like, I acknowledge that I've grown from them.
It's tricky to do both. It's tricky to like understand and remember who you were at a certain age and then also look at it with the perspective that growing up gives you.
Well, because I think a lot of people have a really hard time separating the two. So then they essentially rewrite the past with their current emotions.
Okay. Can I say something?
Yeah.
So there was a memoirist that we did not cover because we read the book and we felt like we just didn't have that much to say about it. We talked about who it was on the Patreon, but
this is like what I wanted that to be. And of course, a man couldn't write that.
That memoir does exactly what we're saying she does so well, which the way that he went back into his childhood and rewrote history with his like modern therapist's language understanding, I was just like, this feels inauthentic to me.
I mean, I actually think a lot of books we've covered do it. His just did it the most egregiously, especially in like recent memory. But then it makes none of the story make sense because it's like, well, if you knew these things, why did you act that way?
The way that you can like from any age look back and see all the things that lined up to get you right into this moment in time. You can't write a memoir with that hindsight. You have to figure out a way to write those plot points, but with the fresh understanding of who you are at the time. And she does that very well.
Yes.
So she talks about how much she loves music and how music for her isn't about the songs themselves. It's about you.
Nostalgia is recall without the criticism of present day, all the good parts, memory without the pain. Nostalgia asks so little of us just to be noticed and revisited. It doesn't require the difficult task of negotiation, the heartache, and the uncertainty that present does.
You had to be there is not always a gloat or admonishment. Often it's an explanation for why something sounds utterly terrible. And that's what she's like. She's like, so much of the music you love is not so much because like, oh, that's the best band that ever existed. It's because at the time to you, you were with your friends experiencing something new and you remember that feeling. That music represents the background track to who you were becoming when everything felt possible.
She talks about growing up and going to just any show she could get to, just like to see as much music as possible and to listen to as much music as possible. She was so eager to just like go to a record store and listen to whatever they gave her. And so then later when she's presenting these albums to her friends and they're like, this kind of sucks, she can't view it without the memory of receiving that record for the first time and listening to it for the first time and being so excited. This is what it is to be a fan, curious, open, desiring for connection, to feel that art has chosen you, claimed you as its witness.
So she gives the background of her parents and her parents' parents. Her father grew up upper middle class in Chicago, Jewish. Familiar?
Never heard of it.
Her mom was more like working class, but they fell in love in college.
An Evanston-Skokie relationship, united at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Are these all?
People know what that is.
And then they moved to Redmond, Washington, a Seattle suburb. She just has all these cute memories of being young. Her first ever concert was Madonna's Like a Virgin. It was a moment I'll never forget, a total elation that momentarily erased any outline of darkness. There was a light everywhere I looked.
She saw George Michael, and that was a revelation because her friend was like lusting after George Michael, but she knew in that moment that I would rather be the object of desire than dole it from the sidelines or perched on my knees. Wink, her friend was like, I want to fuck you, George Michael. But that was like the eye-opener of maybe I want to perform.
She bought her first guitar and saw her first punk and rock shows. She talks about like how buying your first guitar in the suburbs is not some rite of passage. You're going to like a guitar center in the mall and some sterile teen is picking them out for you. In the 10th grade, she started to like go to these concerts in the weekend. I mean, Seattle is such a hub for like punk and rock shows. And that's where everything changed.
So she says her early concerts that she went to were like big performances, obviously like major acts. But then when she was in high school and she started going to like these cool punk shows, she could see the bands up close. I observed the nature of the bands, the internal interactions, their relationships to one another as much as I listened. It seems obvious, but it was the first time I realized that music was playable, not just performable, that it had a process and a seed, a beginning, middle, and end. And this like reminds me, I feel like we tie every single memoir to like our comedy experience. But for me, that was stand-up when I like went to my first house show. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh my God, these are just people in a house having a show. Like anyone can do comedy.
That's so true.
And I did see Gerard Carmichael there, but I was like, if Gerard Carmichael's in a house, why can't I be in a house?
For me, however, I needed to be there to see guitarists like Kim Warnick and Kurt Bloch of the Fastbacks or Doug March of Tree. People play chords and leads in the wholly relatable attire of threadbare t-shirts and jean shorts, enact a weird nerd sexiness, strangely minimal, maximally perverse. I watched them play songs that weren't coming out of thin air from behind a curtain. I needed to press myself up against the small stages, risking crushed toes, bruised sides, and the unpredictable undulation of the pit, just so I could get a glimpse of who I wanted to be. I found this very interesting to the kind of performer she becomes, because she's very frank about the fact that she is like not a deeply talented guitar player. She is not technically skilled. It sounds like she doesn't know much. She's like, I don't know what a riff is. I'm like,
I guess I think she's being
modest.
Not necessarily modest, but like she does know that she has a very specific style that has been inspirational to people, and it's like very notable. But like I also think
she's not somebody who learned the rules so that then she could break them later. She's not somebody who like came out of a classical understanding of music and how songs are written and then was like, here's how I'm going to tweak it. She like grew up watching punk people and being like, oh, you could just scream and mean it.
I guess the thing that I believe is that you are not a guitarist in the best rock band in America, according to Time magazine, if you're like not pretty fucking good at guitar. So I wonder if she's saying that because she's like afraid of the purists who are going to come after her if she's like too self-congratulatory about her guitar playing abilities. I like the idea that you don't have to have started when you were like 4 years old making your hands bleed to like be really good.
I don't know. She like makes a stink of kind of being like, for us, it was like the performance and we got out on stage for the first time and we didn't know how to play together and we like didn't know how like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, she does kind of like make a to-do. We were figuring it out as we go musically.
I agree that they figured it out as they went. And I think as they figured it out, they got really good.
She started pretty young. I mean, they like were like out touring when she was 20. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think she was of this mindset that you have to get really good and then you like start a band. Like she kind of came to the scene throwing down, being like, first and foremost, punk is a performance.
Yeah, I feel like she learned as she
is like
went.
A performer before she is like a technical.
Yeah, I agree. So she has always wanted to be a performer. And I think it just took a while to find out what kind of performer she was going to be. As a child, I was engaged in a continuous dialogue with fantasy escapism and performance, from conducting mock interviews with the posters and pictures on my bedroom wall to attempting to turn the woods behind my house into a restaurant.
I had very little desire to be present, only to be presentational or to pretend.
She felt very kind of like forgotten in her home life. And I think that it was just because her parents were pretty absorbed in other shit.
She also was like a weird little kid. She was obsessed with old stuff. She was always throwing on mystery dinner parties and making people dress up. She would like write letters to soap opera stars and use those letters like her diary. And they would write back. And those were kind of her favorite pen pals.
That is weird. Any response implied that I existed, that I was not a weirdo, that I'd be okay. My other form of validation was through performance. Performance gave me something to do in a given moment in a room.
I wanted people to listen, to witness, or simply notice me. I held people hostage with this need for attention. It was both an imposition and a plea.
My mother likened my melodrama to the silent film actress Sarah Bernhardt, as if my frustrations and feelings weren't normal but calculated and contrived.
She was always trying to get like the neighborhood kids to put on performances with her.
She really just like has always had really big feelings, but she seems like a pretty tempered person. So it just comes out fully in performance.
She talks about it growing up. She says in elementary school she was confident, that made her liked and popular. Despite all the sleepovers or the sneaking out to drape toilet paper over someone's house or the weeks at summer camp together, Tammy, Jennifer, and I drifted apart once we entered junior high. But they were my cohorts during the happiest childhood years, the ones in which my mom was healthy and present enough to help me with my homework, not to mention that ridiculous election speech. And when it didn't seem odd that my dad bought a motorcycle and drove off to Canyonlands on a vacation with a male buddy. So she like had a good 10 to 12 years, I think. And then her nuclear family really fucking fell apart and she began to feel so isolated and alone.
So when she was 14, her mom went to the hospital for anorexia. So she talks about learning the word anorexia when she was younger and kind of like almost taunting her mom with it because she just didn't really understand its implications.
Well, I think you don't realize what's happening when it's in front of you. So it's like you see your mom not eating and you're like, oh, what, are you anorexic? And it's like, quite literally, yes, she was.
She fully was. And so when she was 14, she checked into an inpatient program.
She would be gone for nearly a month.
An illness in the family felt like currency that I needed to make myself more interesting. I was someone they felt sorry for. I had a newfound status in the carpool circuit. I rode shotgun everywhere. This is what I mean about like the way she can look back on these moments in her life and like really illustrate her thought process, because that is such a kid thing to do, to like not really understand, or like a teenager thing to be like, I don't know, I have a story that makes me more emotionally mature than everyone else.
Yeah. She talks about how she didn't really have that many friends anymore, but she was always kind of getting pity invited places where she'd sit in the living room and chat with the mom. She was the kid who hung out with the moms. When a friend's father died of Lou Gehrig's disease, her mother counted me among the first to be notified. I was getting ready for school when I received the call. I took the news like a pro. No tears. When was the funeral? Did they need anything? Later in the school bathroom during lunch, I delivered the story to our other friends with the gravity and stoicism of a nightly news anchor.
But the reality of my mom being in the eating disorders unit was far less glamorous and a lot more painful. And then she gets more into her parents' backstory and who they were. And this I found, speaking of ever heard of it, Chicago suburbs lifestyle. My family didn't talk much to one another, but we did talk about one another. My dad's parents would refer to their daughter-in-law as her or she, talking about my mother as if she was invisible. Like, not to throw people under the bus, but my God, is it a gossip central? Like, it really is this weird thing where, like, I have a lot of family members that I don't talk to that often, but I know about everything going on in their lives, and it just kind of gets relayed like a phone tree. Like, you don't really have to talk to anyone that often as long as you talk to someone kind of often.
I suppose we were better observers than communicators. We were all subjects to be worried over, complained about, even adored, but never quite people to be held or loved. There was an intellectual, almost absurd distance. Oh my God. Then she tells like the most fucked up story about a family dog.
Yeah, I really can't get it. Don't. Skip it.
I'll skip to the last line. When we decided to put her down, not because she was sick, but because she was old and neglected.
That's the line that I couldn't handle.
A remnant of a family we no longer recognized. My father asked my sister to do it. My sister was 16. She drove the dog to the vet one day after school by herself. No one else said goodbye. Woof. The distance and detachment created a loneliness. My mother and I started to fight all the time. She was retreating from the world, a slow motion magic trick. Meanwhile, I was getting louder, angrier, and wilder.
While I had discussed my mom's illness with my friends' parents, I had never thought to talk about it with my own mother. Puberty was a confusing time to be around so many women whose bodies had become a sort of battleground.
She just has all these memories of visiting her mom in the eating disorder unit, and she remembers the day she left when they do this circle time and everybody says something in their diary about the person who's leaving. As I listened, I sensed that within this configuration of fellow patients, my mother was a known entity. She felt cared for, safe, and seen, but I was outside the circle. My mother was a stranger to me.
I felt drenched, soggy. I wanted everyone to be stronger, to embrace the stoicism I was perfecting. I judged. And then she talks about like trying to tell stories, to like engage her mom, to really like reignite their intimacy. Within a year, she left for good.
She never really gets into her mom leaving for good. Like she just stops getting mentioned. This is kind of like you just never hear about the mom again, except to hear that like in 10 years, it turns out she has a husband that she lives with in Seattle and they speak maybe once a year.
Yeah.
She just like doesn't have a mother anymore.
I think that they like got close eventually after this book.
Oof.
Or something, because the mom and stepdad actually died in 2022 in a car accident in like Italy.
Why?
Well, sometimes cars have accidents.
No. Then why are we getting in them?
I don't know. I try not to, actually. The reason I wanted to uncover this book is because right now Sleater-Kinney just came out with a new album, and like a lot of the press tour has been about how Corin does most of the singing because Carrie couldn't stop crying.
Oof.
So I wonder if they got close. I don't know. I got to listen to some of those interviews and find out what happened there.
So now we get into her relationship with her father, who of course she was left with after the mother left the family when Carrie was 15. Carrie being the older sister of a younger sister who never gets mentioned once, really.
Not really. At one point she yells penis in the car. I don't know if you guys remember the penis game. It's the game where you just yell penis as loud as you can.
And her dad gets so mad. We also received the International Male Catalog, a men's underwear catalog that is essentially a showcase for big European cocks. Only in retrospect can I find clues to my father's gayness.
So eventually, and this is much later, she's like in her 20s, her dad comes out as gay.
And it's like barely discussed. But when she was at college, her dad started having boarders at the house. And she's like, I don't think he was dating any of them. It was just kind of practice for what it would be like to live a different life. I would occasionally come home on the weekends and no longer feel like the house was a retreat or even mine. I was simply crashing there like anyone else.
Her dad also got cancer twice.
This feels so small to her story, though. She's so isolated from her family that her father having cancer is almost just a small appendage to some other sentence.
This part, though, I found very interesting that before her dad, when he was diagnosed with cancer for a second time, he had to have an operation that he was not sure he was going to survive. So he flew to Texas to visit some friends that he knew that were gay, that he'd met via like chat rooms. His coming out story is pretty interesting, actually, if you ever dive into this book. But he like met these friends. He flew to Texas to like come out to them and then flew back because he wanted to have come out to someone in the world in case he died.
He comes out to her a few years later. So I guess I'm coming out to you. He said it just like that in a sort of meta way, as if he were along for the ride that his new self was taking him on, which was typical. Like he was just a sidekick in his own life, a shadow, though I'm assuming it was more of a linguistic fumbling, not knowing exactly how to come out or what words to use. She talks about how after her dad came out to her, she had this feeling of wanting to become very conservative and get married and have kids. Who would fly the flag of normality? My sister bore this burden more heavily than I did, but I immediately felt like I should be popping out kids within a few years of my dad realizing he was gay. Let our parents be anorexic and gay. That shit is for teenagers. My sister and I would be adults. We would be conventional, conservative even. Guns, God, country, and my contrarian reactionary self. But then she says, I always felt like I didn't know my dad. Despite all my initial conflicts about how trying to reconcile the father I had with as a child to the one I have now, I am thankful that he is happy and that he did not waste another second. Now there is someone to know.
That's really nice.
In my junior year of high school, I formed a band with a few girls called Born Naked. She thinks that's a bad name. I like that.
It's like a little bit hack.
But it's true. You're going to tell me the truth is hack?
Yeah.
If it's so hack, then why hasn't anyone been born with an outfit? Surely someone reactionary, surely someone with style would have rectified by now. What band name do you have should you wake up with a musical ability?
Oh my God, this is actually too hard.
I don't believe it's hard. I believe you have like a list. I can't believe it's not on your phone.
I feel like there are some that I think of and I'm like, oh, that would be so good, but I never write them down. And then the other day, my friend who works in music was like presenting something and she texted me being like, what are some good fake band names I can put on this presentation? And I had such a meltdown about it. I actually couldn't come up with a single thing because I was like scared that everything I typed, like once you type it out, you're like,
it was
oh my
like
God.
Born Naked.
Yeah. Once you write it down, you're like, oh my God, loser.
Okay, maybe my band would be called Hobos, but not after unhoused people in Hoboken, where I'm from. The best homemade ice cream store was Hobos. And what a funny thing to name an ice cream store. Why would they call it that?
That is a really funny thing to call an ice cream store. I feel like a lot of the names I've written down have been like short 1 or 2 word things. But I think in actuality of knowing my own damn self, it would be, it'd be a full sentence. It would say,
3 doors down and to the left and over the fence and through the woods.
My dog Bug's favorite band to listen to.
God, as somebody who has been just chained to your SEO mistakes, I'm glad to know your band will be a side project.
Anyway, so she learned some chords from her neighbor who, if you're, a music nerd, he ended up playing in the band Sunny Day Real Estate. This is like the stories that I like. Again, this is what I thought Reggie Watts would be. I know we hate the name droppy bullshit, but like sometimes when you have like cool music history things just like intertwining with each other.
This is different to me than even a Dave Grohl. Because Dave Grohl is like, you'll never believe it. And there I was at the Grammys and who tapped me on the shoulder but Paul McCartney. Buddy, what are you doing here? Talking to me. The Grammys honoree of a lifetime. Like, no, she came out of an incredible hub of music that dominated an era.
And it's cool to know like that it really was just like a small town of musicians who knew each other.
Yeah, like later when they go on tour and she's like, here's who opened for us. And it's like the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, the White Stripes, the Black Keys. I'm like,
cool.
That's crazy. Or she's like, I skipped that guy's performance. He ended up being
Cat Power.
Or later when she's like, ugh, I threw out my friend's CD. It was from this guy she had a crush on, Elliot. So I'm like, okay, it's cool to think about them all in like college being young. It's not cool. The way Dave Grohl was like, and there I was playing with Prince when I had done nothing but playing Nirvana. I'm like, yeah, buddy.
John Legend said to me, I know who you are. You're Dave Grohl. Why wouldn't he know who you are?
That's what I just feel like Dave Grohl, unfortunately, for his own memoir, got so successful so fast that I'm just like, yeah, I don't know. You met who? At Oprah's house? Well, likely place for him to be.
Listen, this was like a real holy shit beautiful. The albums that he started introducing her to, Sinead O'Connor, U2, and R.E.M. I mean, my 90s heart. Jeremy became our conduit, taking these formidable albums and making them feel like ours.
She does have all these funny stories about being like, some band opened. It was Nirvana. So she gets really into this music scene and she gets into specifically like the female bands, which I shouldn't be allowed to say because that's like the whole point in this book is to stop calling them female bands.
Because they're regular bands.
But unfortunately, it was important to her. So she loved Bikini Kill. It just perfectly summed up being a young girl. Bikini Kill's music really gave me a form, a home, a physicality to my teenage turmoil. Eventually, I was able to harness that tumultuousness, build it up, and make it my own. It's hard to express how profound it is to have your experience broadcasted back to you for the first time, how shocking it feels to be acknowledged, as if your own sense of realness had only existed before as a concept. I felt like I could step inside something. It was a revelation. I think this is what I loved about this book so much, is as much as she's describing her experiences as a musician, she's describing her experiences as a fan of music. And in that way, this is such a relatable book.
Yeah.
And there's something so honest about being I was a musician because I was a fan. And I was looking for a way to even more feel these feelings, which to me is a more interesting emotional journey than, not to be mean to him again, but the Dave Grohl of it all, which is just and then we played this venue, and then we played this venue, and then I bought a house in Virginia. You'll never believe how big an acre is.
So big. Okay, so she talks about as she's discovering music and putting up posters on her wall, I resented the parts of myself that were late to adopt coolness, late to learn. I wanted to have always possessed a savviness and sophistication, even though I clearly had neither. This is something that through the end of the book, she really maintains a lack of coolness. I think that her one area of misperception is of how she's perceived to other people.
Yeah, it's always a joke. She's could you imagine people having a crush on me?
I'm you the seem cutest little rock star in the world.
Who I guess also is goofy and funny. And is also kind of fucked up. That's everybody's favorite thing. A kind of fucked up, goofy, funny, serious musician.
Yeah. I guess that's what I mean when I say mid-career. She must have been very good. But I think she can't understand how she's perceived.
I guess she is also somebody who one day decided to be in a very long-running comedy skit show, which is something that SNL fails to do every week. I guess she's just a deeply talented person. But she does actively portray herself as somebody who's just getting up there being weird and screaming.
Yes.
And to her, that's what the music was.
Yeah. And she's always there was no melodies really, but there is. If you listen to the music, you're okay, this is well-made music that's really good and really intense.
There's no way to know that if you read her book.
Yes.
I'd started running away from home in high school. Nothing dramatic, simply leaving for a few days with no intention to return home. My moods and my whereabouts went undetected for the most part, and I think in part that is why I didn't want to be around. I felt unseen and thus sought out visibility everywhere. I was learning 2 sets of skills simultaneously, adaptation, linguistic and aesthetic, in order to fit in, but also how to survive on my own. So she ends up applying to college, and she has to go to Western Washington University, and after a semester, she's I'm out of here. This place sucks dick.
She really never intended to fully go, but she didn't know what else to do.
And she's obsessed with music coming out of Olympia, Washington. And she's I gotta go there. And I guess there's just this one community college. And she's Dad, if I drop out of school right now, I'll go to community college in Olympia. But for her, she's Olympia is the college.
She has to get to Olympia. So in Olympia, there's all these great bands Heaven to Betsy.
And Mecca Normal and Bikini Kill. This is the show where she goes, and Nirvana, having become very famous, was trying to just do a chill show. So they were the secret openers. And Carrie's I didn't even care. I was there to see my gals.
Heavens to Betsy. Ladies.
So she's obsessed with this singer, Corin, who's the lead singer of Heavens to Betsy, who is the other third of Sleater-Kinney. So it's kind of funny to be Kurt Cobain, I'll catch up with you later. I have to watch this girl that I'm about to work with for the next decade. I won't have another chance to see her.
But it's so sweet and cute the way they all come into each other's lives. We'll get to it later, but Lance Bangs, who to this day is still married to Corin, the way he came into their lives. I'm it's cute the way they were witnessing art that resonated with them and then being I will be in your life forever. The whole punk scene felt very made up as it went along. There was a malleability to it as we vacillated between experimented with or claimed identities. If someone didn't feel included, if someone felt marginalized, they would form their own band.
So she sees this show, and this is still when she's at that Western Washington University. When Heavens to Betsy finished their set, I walked up to Corin. I told her that I wanted to drop out of Western and move to Olympia. She said I should do that, and soon. It felt like an order. That was good advice.
It literally changed her life in a positive way, if you ask me.
So then she has a band called Excuse 17, which would eventually tour with Heavens to Betsy.
And then on that tour, her and Corin got pretty close. I wanted to have a girl gang. So she's making music with this girl called Jana, and they would put musician wanted ads all over the place. And they were always auditioning people by going to their houses because they didn't have a drum set. And then she's also auditioning for other bands. And there's this band she's obsessed with called the 7 Year Bitch.
What do you think of that name?
It's so good.
That one you think is good?
No, they're all terrible. But I'm thinking of them in a 90s brain. And I'm Heavens to Betsy, 7-year bitch.
Heavens to Betsy doesn't bother me. What is that a pun on?
I think it's just like you said, heavens to Betsy. Ay, ay, ay.
See that one? Okay. 7-year bitch is like
terrible.
Like a bumper sticker in a gas station that got burnt down.
Okay, listen. If there was a good band called Born Naked, I like a lot of bands that have really bad names, okay? That's fine. It's fine to have a bad name, but like I feel like 7-year bitch, even if she hadn't said it, the way she explains them as a band that was like out of her league, I don't know, just like these girls in a band called 7-year bitch walking around making other people feel small. I'm like, oh, nailed it. Whereas if they had been like some tryhards out of high school, I would have been like, 7-year bitch my ass. Anyway,
they're this huge band that she's obsessed with.
And so she answers an ad in the paper for a guitarist. And it's Elizabeth from 7-year bitch. And she's like, why is this band that is so amazing putting ads in the paper like me and Jana? So she auditions and it like doesn't go great, especially because they're like, well, you're only 18 years old and we play bars. And she was like, okay, totally. So she writes them an unhinged letter, like about all of her life trauma and like how John Frusciante from the Red Hot Chili Peppers was only 18 when he joined the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And she's like, I recognize that it might have been a lot to compare myself to like a literal prodigy. I also recognize it might have been a lot to like put my emotional trauma in this letter. And no one really answered. And I would see her at shows and she would look at me weird. And I think I did something wrong.
During the next few months, I occasionally ran into Elizabeth at Seattle shows. She was always kind to me, but I had clearly become a pest. Later, when I knew what it felt like to carry the weight of your fans' aspirations, I would remember the way Elizabeth looked at me after I had sent the letter. A look of pity, distrust, and weariness. There's a gulf of misunderstanding between musicians and their fans, and often so much desperation that the musician can't possibly assuage, rectify, or heal. You feel helpless and you feel guilty. With Sleater-Kinney fans, I try to be generous, but I soon grew uneasy.
So she talks about how the goal with music is to just like make music bigger than herself. In the early years of Sleater-Kinney, we played at Seattle's Crocodile Cafe. Elizabeth was at the show. By then, 7-year bitch had broken up. She came up to me, complimented my guitar playing, and told me she loved the band. Elizabeth didn't recognize me as the girl who'd gone over to her house that day or had written her an overly earnest tell-all letter. I was relieved that music had done exactly what I always wanted it to do, which was turn me into someone else. It's so interesting to reconcile this like earnest, neurotic weirdo with like kind of a punk powerhouse.
I guess because I've met people, I'm like, of course.
Yeah.
The people who give it most on stage are the people who need it most off stage.
I agree with that, but it also is like to the people off stage who are like, it could never be me on stage. Like it can be anyone who wants it.
Yeah. It really could be anyone.
You know, people that take us to come see us. April, we're coming to Austin, Texas.
Listen, if you think we suck, come for the confidence boost. Come to our show and go, oh, it could be anyone. I guess it could just be me. And then leave our show saying that was the shittiest shit I ever saw and pursue your fucking dreams because it literally could just be anyone. I don't know.
Totally.
So around this time, she's also getting drunk and kissing girls and being like random.
How weird.
I can't believe we all got so drunk and kissed. For some other girls, it was really upsetting to find out that they loved kissing girls. But for her, she was like, oh, we were just like, what?
I don't even know.
She goes, no, you just cuddle with your female friends all the time, like platonically.
So then they play their first big live show and have no idea how anything works. Like they just don't understand monitors and stuff. We have this problem sometimes.
Oh my God. There's something weird echo that if you're not standing, I get so stressed when I can hear myself echoing.
Yeah. And think about in a band when you're
I need
trying
a Taylor
to keep
Swift
time.
setup.
Yeah. With the clicking.
I mean, I just like need an inner ear monitor because sometimes.
Oh my God. I have to send you these TikToks where this girl who's a musician like plays performance tracks. It's clicking and it's like they count you in. They'll be like first chorus tick 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 and like it like counts you in and like gives you vocal cues
because you can't hear anything.
Yeah.
It's like hard to believe because I've been in the stands and I heard the music. So I'm like, well, she's closer to the music. Why can't she hear it better than me? But I also know from being on stage, there have been times I'm like 3 feet to the right and I'm so overwhelmed by the sound of like my own echo that I feel like a deer in the headlights. I'm like, I don't know what to do. We had to shut down the show.
Yes. And with instruments, it's so hard because like you're trying to keep time with other people while it's echoing around and whatever. There's a lot of technicalities. She says rock people say it can't be institutionalized or taught. And part of that is true, but there are technical aspects that you can and should know before you get on stage.
How, if the process has been demystified, less of a private club or secret code, we wouldn't have sat in the dark theater after we played, watching Codeine deliver a taut, deliberate set while we felt undeserving of having ever been on stage, blaming one another and ourselves, mad and heartbroken. So she finally moves to Olympia, and it is summer 1993, baby. She's 18 years old. She's going to be 18 forever.
I don't know much theory, but I play by instinct and feel. I could probably get schooled by an 8-year-old on tonics and inversions, but back then the word musician had a professional characteristic to it that made it even more alienating.
When I moved to Olympia, I didn't really think of myself as a musician. I don't know if I would consider myself a musician now, not in the technical sense. Do you see where I got this idea?
Yeah. I agree with like the way it's interpreted in this book, but like in my mind, I can't fathom that she's like not really good at guitar. I agree that she does keep saying that, and I'm saying I don't believe her. I showed up to Olympia a wanderer. I had about 2 months until school started. I spent the first few weeks walking around downtown and stopping in the State Theater, thrift stores. So she just kind of bops around and like tries to ingratiate herself with the music scene.
I knew who all the players were as if I was joining a sorority. I wanted to meet everyone. These musicians and punk bands whom I'd read about in fanzines or seen mentioned in record label newsletters. Can I say, I know I'm in my magazine era, but reading this book, I'm like, we got to bring back a fanzine.
No, I went to the zine exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum, and I was like, we got to get zines back in here. They're so fun. And when she talks about zines throughout this, like when Corinne started a zine where she would just like review sound guys, how fun.
There feels about a zine the way I feel about a Patreon, which is like, right now, everything carries so much weight because you never know if it'll go viral.
Yeah.
And sometimes things will like go viral online and everybody be like, why'd you put it? And you're like, I sometimes want to defend these people and be like, sometimes when you put up a photo of your friend eating a sandwich weird, you genuinely never thought 10 million people would have a comment about it. Sometimes you just said, that's a funny way to eat a sandwich. And you never would have thought that there would be death threats and like psychological evaluations and CPS getting called because your friend ate a sandwich backwards, because you just couldn't have ever predicted that everyone in the world would see and care about this sandwich eating thing. And I feel like something about a zine, because when it's physical and it's controlled like that, there's so much more safety to just be goofy. Because it's kind of crazy. Corinne, she did this zine where she took photos of every sound system guy that they played for and wrote about their personality and how good they were.
Like reviewed the people.
Let me tell you, if I were to have done this, I would have gone to jail because some of the things I have to say about some of the sound people we've worked with, not a pretty thing.
And some of them have been so nice.
But a lot of them have been really rude to us. I can't imagine how nice the zine was because I can't imagine how well they were being treated either. And I wish I could do that. But the problem is I don't want to be held responsible for 10 million people going, you were wrong to say that about the sound guy. The sound guy was wrong to say that about you. And now
you can't even talk about a croissant in this city without someone saying you said it wrong.
I know. It's just too much. Sometimes things need to be inside jokes for just a couple tens of thousands of subscribers. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes I'm like, this is for 13,000 people to look and laugh at, but no more. Because we can all keep a secret.
Yes.
I was scared my first summer in Olympia, flailing but strangely bold. There is something so cute about when people are so shy and they're young, but then they look back and they go, I'm more confident now, but good Lord, the things I was doing then. What risks?
What risks? Olympia was quintessentially an in-crowd versus out-crowd. Visiting bands were either in awe or felt thoroughly snubbed. Though there was indeed a certain amount of snobbery, I think it was that our interactions had been codified partly as an identifier, but also by necessity. And she talks a little bit about the way that like the punk scene is a bit bullshitty in its rule setting.
Yeah,
like
the coalescing, the place for all misfits. Actually, it's quite a difficult club to be accepted to.
Yeah.
The place for everybody else that didn't get into the cool club is actually now the coolest club and has the most eye rolling of, don't I fucking get it. And she says, like, for her, it was just the experience of watching these live performances. All the music was still very much a mystery, how it all cohered. I just learned very little between good and bad bands, popular or obscure. Every band was good. Every player had purpose, was standing his or her ground, contributing, making a sound. Any band was worth buying a single from, supporting, dancing along to. I could find appeal in the sway of a bass player or the cocky head bop of a drummer. Mm-hmm. I stand by it, drummer. Mostly what I felt was that I wanted to do that too.
So she's still playing with Excuse 17. Living in Olympia, we had lost perspective on what a traditional group looked or sound like. Band configurations were abnormal, either multi-limbed or conspicuously amputated. And so eventually she starts playing with Corinne. I don't know if there's ever a official, like, we're starting a band together. Mm-hmm. But she talks about how their style of playing, they both just, like, fit seamlessly with each other. My entire style of playing was built around somebody else playing guitar with me, a story on its own that sounded unfinished, a sonic to be continued, designed to be completed by someone else. I think part of the uniqueness of our sound is that we rarely landed on a basic chord. The music stays somewhere in between, and it's not always quite right.
So she also says in Heavens to Betsy, Corinne had always tuned her guitar to her own voice. So it was completely arbitrary that when she plugged into a tuner one day in an attempt to coordinate our tuning, her guitar happened to be in C sharp. We never thought to alter it. This is 1.5 steps below standard tuning, which creates a sourness, a darkness that you have to overcome if you're going to create something at all harmonious. And so she's like, even when we have something like with a pop sheen, there's an underlining bitterness to it.
I find that so fascinating, and also it explains, I think, based on my music leanings, why I never got like fully into them. At the time, I don't think we planned on doing much with this band. There was very little deliberation, no long list of potential names or backup ideas. Sleater-Kinney was just streets.
It was just straight near them. Corinne was very dark and serious, and Carrie wanted to be myself around her, and myself was perhaps more goofy than I'd let on. I wanted to balance the seriousness with levity.
It's so interesting because I know she's a goof, but like she doesn't seem that silly.
Yeah.
In this book.
She also starts hooking up with Corinne. Corinne had a boyfriend. She stole her basically, and they start dating. She also befriends Miranda July. There's nothing really here besides the fact that she knew and still knows Miranda July, who's a famous person.
It's funny to me that when Corinne broke up with her boyfriend for Carrie, Dan, her boyfriend, gave Carrie a photo of him sitting in a basketball hoop and said, "Congrats, you bagged my girl."
It's not him.
Oh, it's a guy?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought he was in the hoop.
No. If he could get up to the hoop, I'm sure he wouldn't have lost his girlfriend.
If you could dunk yourself, you could get any girl on earth.
So in 1994, in the fall, they fly to Australia. Why? I don't even really know, to be honest. They don't know anybody there. They're like staying in some random dude's house. They have $600 to make them 3 months.
Yeah, it does not make any sense.
But she's like, you just got to be uncomfortable and then you make really good music. And I'm like, oof. That's why I've never done anything good. I hate being uncomfortable.
I know. I love being comfy cozy. That's why we got these chairs.
So they're in Australia. Why? I'm not 100% sure.
But they make their first album. They find a drummer in Australia. Okay, I was like, so you found an Australian drummer like for this project?
And then later she's like, yeah, unfortunately we had to break up with her. It turned out it wasn't particularly convenient to have an Australian drummer in Australia. And I was like, of course it wasn't.
Why would you have had an Australian drummer? That makes no sense.
It was an extreme way to start, but I learned later on how hard it can become to unsettle yourself, to trip yourself up. And I think that that's a good place to write from. It's important to undermine yourself and create a level of difficulty so the work doesn't come too easily.
Corinne was shy in person, but confident and earnest on stage. I was introverted and overly cerebral, using playing as a means to get out of my head. Together, we felt bold enough to be amplified.
Well, we lacked in dedicate and deliberation. We made up for in tenacity. We played guitar during the day and jumped on stage at night in pubs, opening for the Cananes.
In those years, I was in awe of the bravery I saw around me. I never quite felt brave myself then, but I watched a lot of fearless things happen. I could play at bravery in the songs. I could play at sexiness or humor long before I could actually be or embody any of those things.
Sleater-Kinney allowed me to try on so many roles.
I guess one of the things I really liked about this is just the exploration of like testing things out boldly. I think especially right now in the social media era, everyone is so afraid of being perceived that they like can't try or do anything ever.
It was so Northwest, all about the music. The 90s had a monolithic feel, a sturdiness, realism as opposed to fantasy.
Can I say something though? If you are someone who's like interested in testing out creative pursuits publicly, when you think about the hype boys or people that like had flash moments of insane virality, like you forget about so much stuff. People forget about everything.
I mean, something someone said to me one time about like the cringiness of posting is they were like, the irony is most things flop. So like, what are you afraid of failing, of having nobody see it? Well, then nobody saw it. So who cares?
Yeah.
Like, who are you going to be embarrassed from in front of all those people who didn't see what you did? Yeah. By definition, they're not watching. That's the problem.
Someone one time reached out to me because they were scared to post stuff online. And I was like, what is the fear? And they're like, that I would look like an idiot in front of millions of people. And I was like, oh, so you're already
worried you're too big.
I was like, you're seen by how many people? Sounds very successful to me.
In the punk scenes we came from, honesty was valued tantamount, or even more so than artistry. Even influencers and icons like Calvin Johnson or Kathleen Hanna were still brought back down to earth by their engagement with politics and ethics. Once you have to explain or over-explain what you're doing, it's hard to be larger than life. Every time you have to talk about it, you feel smaller, more accessible perhaps, but certainly not mythic. Something so interesting is about like the relationship between music and politics and trying to fit it in this punk scene. And I like get it. Like to be cool means that other people think you're cool, but then you can't ever be successful because that's uncool. And you have to reject everything, but then you also can't explain yourself. I don't know. It's a fucking
like you
trap.
Have to care about stuff,
but in a way where you don't really care.
Yeah. So they put out their first album on Chainsaw Records, self-titled. It would be more of a document than an album, a timestamp. And then it seems like, go pretty immediately into their second album, Call the Doctor.
She also talks about like trying to figure out who they were because they didn't want to be thought of as like queercore. They didn't want to be thought of as punk. They didn't want to be thought of as like riot girl. Those identifiers felt important at the time. People were staking out territory, constructing niches in a punk landscape that felt vast. Parceled out like land claims, punk was divided by city, by sound, and by indexers like gender and sexual orientation. And she's like, we didn't want to be put into one of these labels, but the more you reject the label, the more it feels like you're rejecting a part of yourself. It's interesting the way that they're trying to figure out their place. They don't want to be defined, but also they don't want to reject definition and in a way that makes it seem like they're turning their back on these things that they do relate and identify with.
Yeah, it's that weird thing where you want to be undefined, but you can't be undefined because someone has to be able to talk about you in order for you to exist.
And she says these identifiers are important to the fan base because like that's how they get to be themselves. As much as the person on stage is performing, so too is the audience. A lot of young queer kids were able to act out their audience fantasies in a way that they maybe hadn't been allowed to do or felt safe enough to do at other shows.
So they record their second album called The Doctor, and it helps them iron out more of a definition of their sound. On the title track, Corin and I each sang a melody on the chorus. The way of writing and singing was something we tacitly understood. We never discussed it. We never mentioned counter melodies. We didn't want to sing harmonies. Our songs weren't pretty, nor was our style of singing. It sounded scarier not to sing together, rarely allowing the listener to settle into the music.
We recorded Call the Doctor in 5 days.
Like many young women, we felt like we were on display. Lyrically, the songs read like someone setting off an alarm, trying to transform victimization into power. They are not subtle songs.
She also starts doing her habit of meta songwriting, where we were in a band writing about being in a band, singing about singing. I feel the need to point out that our intent was different from those classic rock songs about being on tour. This isn't us singing about roadies, drugs, and groupies, about watching movies on the bus, about rambling on and taking care of business. We were in dialogue with ourselves. We responded to and addressed the fans, the critics, and even our own work.
It makes so much sense for them because that was so much of her identity, was like being involved in the music scene. Like if she's going to write about her experiences, how could she write about something other than like feeling her feelings and thinking through music?
And she started so young. What else is there?
Yeah.
It was also when we started to grapple with something we would grapple with for the rest of our time as a band, that there was always a sense that we were going to have to defend and analyze what we were doing. There's the music itself, and then there's the ongoing dialogue about how it feels. The two seem to be intertwined and almost inescapable. This is about talk about like, what's it like to be a woman in music? And like asking that question is part of the question.
On the last day of mixing Call the Doctor, Corin and I laid on the floor and listened while John played the album back in its entirety. I remembered thinking that we had made a decent record. I hadn't heard anything that sounded like this before. I don't think I ever really felt that way again about one of our records, simply able to enjoy it without any hyper or self-criticism.
During this time, I broke up with Corin. They broke up on a hike and then had to like walk back down the mountain and then drive back.
Yeah, I definitely don't think breaking up on a hike is great.
In reality, it was much more brutal and heartbreaking than they kind of admitted. And she says they ended up like working through it in the music. And now it's so interesting because they can look back at their younger selves and she can be like, wait, were these songs about me? And Corin's like, yeah, I guess they were.
Fucking play about us?
Imagine being in a band singing a song about you and you don't know it. So they're making about $350 per show. They're doing like shitty little college things. They played Yale to about 4 or 5 people. It's very much that road dog life of driving the van 8 or 10 hours. So much of our life is just touring, and touring sucks.
Touring is really hard. They have a couple really major moments after Call the Doctor. Robert Christgau writes a review in The Village Voice, which is just like kind of how bands got discovered more widely. They also did a photo shoot
for Spin, which was the biggest magazine they had done. And this is so relatable. She's like, I didn't care about it in terms of fans or listeners. I was just excited to have something to show my grandma and dad that proved what I was doing was legitimate.
And boy, oh boy, did that backfire.
Because the journalist had written about how Corin and Carrie had dated. And so her dad calls and is like, are you gay? And she's like, I don't know. We dated. We're not even together anymore. And he says he's cool with it. But
it was like a kind of fucked up piece where Spin didn't talk about the music. Spin, I guess, like just kind of characterized them as these lesbian bandmates who had this like relationship where Carrie followed Corin around. I was reading about someone I didn't know. The writer characterized me as a burbling groupie of Corin's, casting me as obsequious and frivolous. I wasn't reading about myself. I was reading about a character the writer had made to fit his tendinacious point of view about the band, a narrative he was creating that we needed to fit inside. I swear to God, this bitch knows too many big words. But I will say that is kind of a band rite of passage, I think. I've never been in a band, but I imagine to have like a review that comes out and you're like, wait a second, this is supposed to be about the music. But also the fact that the writer outed her, that sucks.
If you haven't spent any time deliberately and intentionally shaping your narrative, if you're unprepared like I was, then one will be written for you. And if you already feel like a fractured self, you will start to feel like a broken one. That's how I felt the day I was outed, splintered, and smashed.
It felt unfair to be labeled when I had yet to find a label for myself. Thus, I decided to retreat, to put the energy further into the performance. My persona would not be about artifice or flamboyancy. It would not be alien or otherworldly. It would be about kineticism. It would be about movement.
Again, I returned to the notion that my salvation was to be in motion. So now they're just traveling all the time.
They had to fire their new drummer, Tony, because there was this one song that Tony just like could not figure out. And then it like made them hate Tony.
And then they hired Janet Weiss, who ends up being their drummer for the next 10 years.
She has this one thing that I like absolutely roll my eyes at. She talks about being like deeply superstitious, which like same. She broke a mirror at one point and says, somehow I sensed that the mirror breaking meant Sleater-Kinney was the opposite of cursed. It was more like a conjuring of serendipity of fortune, some outside force that would take us. It was also a sign. I don't know. I guess some things are good luck and some things are bad luck. If I broke a mirror and then the next day we started CNBC, I'd say that what a fortuitous mirror break. Like you can look at anything as like a positive or a negative symbolism based on how you feel that day.
So then they do the CMJ showcase, which is like an industry showcase, which unsigned artists could find representation and where everyone was vying to be deemed the next big thing. Sleater-Kinney arrived at the tail end of a time when college rock bands were in fact a thing.
So they play this showcase with Janet and they're like, holy shit, Janet is awesome. She fucking smashed the smash out of those drums. She's our drummer.
While Corin and I shaped the world of Sleater-Kinney from the inside conspiratorially, as if from a bunker, Janet was able to see the bigger picture, translating the secret handshake into a more universal greeting. I like really get that metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay, so now they have some success with their second album called The Doctor. They're on tour, and now people are competing to sign them to their band. But she's like, where I came from, to sign to an actual label was considered selling out. However, the irony was these soulless, evil companies put us up in hotels, took us out to dinner, and she's like, for the first time, I felt like a human. Because until then, she'd been like, yeah, I'm a musician, but I'm also a mover. Like, I'm doing all my own shit. I'm sleeping in a van. She's like, it actually is quite nice to have someone take you to a restaurant and let you get a soda and a wine.
Kill Rock Stars was like the local indie label. That was like a big deal. But they were like, maybe we could sign to a bigger label. They had interest from the majors. They had interest from Matador, which was like an indie label, but they had kind of strength more similar to like the major labels. But she like kind of pitched a fit at the Matador meeting.
She showed up 45 minutes late because it seems like she had been eating fucking corn chowder at a Panera.
I felt indignant, contrarian. Janet and Corin were justifiably angry and confounded.
That's being 23 or whatever. You're just like a fucking idiot.
A big part of it was her fearing what the community would think and like not wanting to seem like a sellout.
There would be many decisions in Sleater-Kinney dictated not by reason but by fear, working from a place of consensus like some high-minded, well-meaning nonprofit board, except these were our lives and careers.
The notion of the mainstream's toxicity wasn't always an outright discussion at parties or among friends, but again, the rules were implied and entrenched. But abundant treatises about selling out could be found in zines like Punk Planet or Maxim Rock and Roll. She also says that there was like the recent wake of Kurt Cobain getting too successful and killing himself. And so she was like, I don't know, mainstream success is very bad for you.
Ambition itself seemed anathema, or at the very least drew skepticism. To court fame, money, and press felt dirty, sweaty, and implied you wanted to be accepted and loved by the mainstream, the same people who had rejected, taunted, and diminished you in high school. And then she goes on this whole thing about how back in the day it was so important to keep these things codified because it kind of was your only way of showing who you were. Like if you were obsessed with Goddard movies, you'd wear a fucking striped boat neck shirt. If you loved Twin Peaks, you would dress like a character. And this was your way of living like a wink to the world and being like, this is who I am. This is how I find my people.
Okay, not to sound boomerish, but I kind of miss that.
With access to everything, we can dabble without really knowing. I am not bemoaning a diminishing awareness of references, but it's easier than ever to be divorced from both provenance and predecessors to essentially be a cultural tease. Eventually, I started to cringe at the elitism that was often paired with punk and the like. A movement that professed inclusiveness seemed to actually be highly exclusive. It's so alienating and ungraspable as many of the clubs and institutions that drove us to the fringes in the first place. One set of rules had simply been replaced by new ones, and they were just as difficult to follow.
So now Corinne is falling in love. She's dating Lance Bangs, the music video director. She has this line earlier in the book about kind of how they met or how they were first introduced to each other that I actually found so sweet. They got a box of tapes. They were addressed to Corinne and me. Corinne's case featured a long note explaining how her music had changed his life. The words were sweet and sentimental, poetic and charming. Mine simply said, Carrie. The tapes were from Lance Bangs. 3 years later, he and Corinne were married. That's kind of cute. So anyway, now Corinne and Lance are like officially dating, and it does change their dynamic a lot.
The other two hate Lance. They ban him from all their shows. She's like, I can't really remember why. I guess we thought he was a distraction. I'm like, ugh. It's so funny to look back at how mad you are at 25 and you're like, what were you mad at?
Yeah, the fact that your like ex has a new boyfriend and you're jealous of it.
Yeah.
And you're just like, you can't have boyfriends at the shows. No partners.
Sometimes I think Corinne and I fell back into a kind of platonic love by learning about each other through the songs we were writing. Since we sing on each other's songs and often have to write lyrics that work in conjunction with one another, we are forced to live inside the other person's story, her perspective, her ache. We forgive each other. We empathize with later struggles, loss, and heartbreak. We've witnessed growth and progress and change. We found each other again in the music eventually. I think that's really beautiful.
I think it's really beautiful, but I wonder if just like in the moment, and it's something that can't be discussed because it would open old wounds, if this idea of like, we just randomly hated Lance.
Yeah.
Like it sucks when your ex is like happily in love with someone new and then you're like in a band with them writing songs about how they're happy in love.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to figure into why they hated Lance so much. She hasn't seemed to come to that conclusion about her old self yet.
But that's what I'm saying is I wonder if she has come to that conclusion
a little. She just doesn't want to
admit
it. It's like too, yeah.
I feel like if you write it, it's like a lot. It's funny, I think, to unpack those old wounds by being like, remember, we were so mean to Lance. Anyway, we love you, Lance. But it's like not that funny to be like, I was deeply, deeply jealous of Lance on every level.
She also has this story. So they're working on their third album after Call the Doctor. There's like a snowstorm and they couldn't get a hotel. So she actually calls her mom and asks if she could stay at her mom's house for the night. And her mom literally lets them stay exactly one night. And she's like, there was no room for us. We had to sleep in the living room. It was the one time I saw her. And then you never hear about her mom again.
Yikes. So then they are named Time Magazine Band of the Year.
I really think she was like 25 here.
Yeah.
They're also all mad at each other about the Lance thing.
Dig Me Out comes out and they're like touring. And they're just in the middle of the country on the cover of this magazine. Our success was more critical than commercial. We seemed to appeal to cultural influencers and pundits, but we were too scary for the mainstream. Our songs too strange.
They ultimately do the hot rock, and she says, I consciously worked on not being just a creative partner, but also a friend to Corinne, a dependable ally and a confidant. Eventually, when Corinne and Lance got married, I was the one she asked to give a speech at their wedding.
But as they're touring Dig Me Out, they're like fighting constantly. They resent the shit out of each other.
It's 1997. This is when they're in Europe and they have all these bands that they call to open for them and they're all hanging out and they're just being like little shithead musicians, going out, partying.
She's kind of crazy on stage.
Yeah.
She says, I wanted to obliterate myself, to unlock and uncork the anger, to disappear into the sound and the music. In subsequent years, when I kicked my legs out towards the crowd or swung my guitar close to the heads in the front row, it was about trying to physically harness the moment, to crash into strangers in a horrible but ecstatic impact, a shared bruising. Yikes.
She also says she like never hooked up with any groupies. They barely had any. And the one time she did go back home with somebody, they ended up talking all night. And she kept being like, when do we get to fuck?
Tour stretched on for weeks. It was the longest and the most debauched. They're having like a bad time. They're always having a bad time.
This is the point of every memoir where everything just feels like the same. We're just like kind of running through albums. And I think if you were looking at these critically received, you'd be like, oh, this one did great. This one did blah, blah, blah. But when you're in the middle of it, you're just like, I don't know, man. I was in a van for 8 hours a day. Everyone hated each other. I was getting drunk and ending up in weird situations and it sucked.
One thing that she does always say that I find very interesting, especially after Call the Doctor, is that with every album, they would finish it and she'd be like, I don't know. I don't know what we just finished. It's an album.
And they'd be like, let's do something so different this time so that nobody can say we got worse. So then they do the hot rock. If Dig Me Out had been a punch, the hot rock was the reach of a desperate hand. We hoped people would latch on. People didn't really seem to like it, I guess.
They also dealt with this sitch where their producer kind of thought Corinne was the star of the band. And she was like, we're a trio. It's always been a trio. But it hasn't always been a trio. It was her and Corinne and then like kind of a rotating series of drummers.
And then honestly, they're Travis Barker.
Yeah.
It seemed like much like Travis Barker. She was the most serious musician. They were like, hey, that kind of sounds like a song.
But you know what I just learned from a recent Google search since we took a break while recording? When you said, why is Janet not in the band anymore? It's because she like didn't feel like a true creative partner. She was like, it's like kind of the Carrie and Corin show. But anyway, so that's what was interesting to me because I knew reading this, I guess their second album with Janet, but it's interesting that she's like so insistent, like it's a creative trio, it's a trio, it's a trio. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, she speaks very highly of Janet. I wouldn't say it feels to me as if she's an equal third. She like loves Corin as a friend, of course, but like the way that she speaks about her, I'm just like, holy shit, you guys are soulmates.
So now begins the section of the book where her body is just breaking down constantly. She hurts her back. They have to cancel shows. She's just constantly getting hurt and then having allergic reactions. She goes through this whole phase where she's just always having an allergic reaction and then having panic attacks. The injury changed the momentum and started a precedent of me always having a problem on tour. Touring for me just meant another visit to an emergency room. I've been to doctors and hospitals all over the world. This, by the way, is not a brag.
Then the band is always fighting.
They also never get outside help. They're like, we're a business and we love doing it ourselves. And I was like, God, who does that sound like? What two dumb bitches do I know who keep ruining my fucking life? It's us. The biggest enemy in my life is Claire Parker and her stupid ideas. For those of you who can't tell us apart, I'm Claire Parker.
And I'm Ashley Hamilton.
And this is the biggest mistake of my life.
Oh my God, the amount of times that we've been like, why would we need another person to help us with anything? Shout out to Michael. We would have never come to your city if it wasn't for Michael. We literally, for a while, we were like, we'll just book tours ourselves. Who even cares?
Can I tell you, not one person answered our emails? I was begging like hot dog vendors. I was like, could you give me a Tuesday if I promise 100 people will buy a hot dog? And they were like, I've never heard of you, you piece of shit. Never emailed this hot dog address again. I was like, please.
Could I just buy a single hot dog? No.
Can I riff with my friend in line for a hot dog? Don't you dare.
Oh my God. At one point, we did book ourselves a show where the venue did not know we would need chairs. Okay. So they got a touring agent, they're Michael, and he made it really good.
And then they also have a PR person who's just like some girl from the city who like knows things because she's from a fancy town called Minneapolis. She was a real big city girl. And she was like, oh, you guys are trying to put out an album? Here's a list of journalists that might write about it. And they were like, she was the most professional person we'd ever heard of. That being said, you know what this actually made me think of?
What?
I'm like sitting here scoffing at the idea. I'm like, who hasn't thought of a list? Us. Something that was really dawning on me today was how you're in the New York Magazine and it didn't even occur to you to go get a copy of that thing. Isn't that insane?
Yeah.
Isn't it insane that literally you had your photo in New York Magazine and like your name and stuff? And I remember seeing videos of other people being like, look, it's me in a magazine. And I was like, huh. Oh yeah.
I saw those videos too and I was like, oh my God, cool, the magazine. I wish I could have it. I'll always have screenshots.
Yeah, God bless the screenshot. Put that in a box and let your granddaughter find it.
Imagine Bug showing her friends at the park her screenshots.
My mom was in the New York Times today because Ashley Olsen carried a machete and drank a beer. True story. They called in an expert, Ashley Hamilton. They said, what do you think about that? And she said, I think it's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
They said, write that down. That's our cultural criticism.
Anyway, I wonder what I did say. I got to look up that quote. Maybe go back to my screenshots box.
I'm sure Bug has it in her diary. I'm so proud of my mom. Today she had something important to say and the whole world agreed.
Her diary says, another day, another rejection from the New York Times.
You're her biggest competition.
Okay, so the band is feeling disjointed. They're fighting, they're yelling. One thing that I find really interesting is the way she talks about like writing a song from a perspective, which I do think in the last couple of years has become actually normalized because of like Beyonce and T Swift. When a woman sings a non-personal narrative, listeners and watchers must acknowledge that she's not performing as herself. And if she's not performing as herself, it's not her wooing us, loving us. We don't get to have her because we don't know who exactly she is. An audience doesn't want female distance. They want female openness and accessibility, familiarity that validates femaleness.
I'm going to write an essay about this for our newsletter.
I'm excited.
And it's going to have a lot to do with Jessica Alba and the Honest Company.
Interesting.
You're going to have to subscribe to find out why.
Persona for a man is equated with power. Persona for a woman makes her less of a woman, more distant and unknowable, and thus threatening. When men sing personal songs, they seem sensitive and evolved. When women sing personal songs, they are inviting us and vulnerable, or worse, catty and tiresome. That's very interesting.
And Jessica Alba agrees.
I'm excited to read this.
Thanks.
Then she reads a review where people are mean. She goes, I'm never reading a review again.
They hated all hands on the bad one. She says, that night on stage, I thought about the negative criticism far more than I did the sold-out crowd. It was the last time I would read a review. She also talks about how hard it was to constantly see the sexism with which they were being dealt. Just all anybody could talk about was that they were women. How do they hold those guitars with their tiny hands?
Internally, the band is stressed, but live, they're doing great. More confident than ever. They go to Europe.
I mean, it's good, but it's bad.
All these experiences sum up the disparities and vacillations that typify tour. The ridiculous and the sublime, the charming and the execrable. Why does she talk like
really
this?
Having a hard time with this. This book is really cutting the wheat from the chaff, so to speak.
In a journal entry I wrote on the flight home, I noted that it felt like I'd been gone for months instead of 3 weeks.
It is interesting that you would think tour would be a chapter in someone's book, but her whole life was tour.
She's just always on tour. She does talk about the ups and the downs where at one point they were in a music video with Sonic Youth and then walking home she stepped in poop. Also, was this the chapter? I actually do want to talk about this part where they go to a party.
Yes.
Oh, that's what I wanted to talk about. Okay, I think a recurring theme, something that I'm learning through this podcast, I feel like
how many people went to Oberlin?
No, how much Oberlin fucking blows.
I will say 18-year-olds who think they're smarter and more artistic than everybody else, but also are in Ohio is of course.
Of course, but I think it's really interesting that so many books we've read, Oberlin has always been presented as this liberal creative oasis. And the more I've learned about Oberlin, which before was none.
I'm very aware of Oberlin, and that tells you what kind of person goes to Oberlin.
I'm very unaware of Oberlin, and that tells you that I'm
salt of the earth. Salt of the earth people don't go to Oberlin.
It actually is really bad. I'm sorry, but everyone who goes there is so self-important and bullshitty. And
everyone who went to Oberlin in 6th grade won their poetry for the state contest where they were in a collection of poetry from all the greatest writers from the ages 10 to 17, which is not any great writer is 10 to 17.
But can I say that this is why I think Oberlin is a breeding ground for suckiness is because no 18-year-old should be that confident in their creativity.
I agree. And also, might I say, not good enough to get into one of the good schools.
There should be a place where 18-year-olds can go and hone their creativity. But the idea that they're already good at stuff, get the fuck out of here with your experimental crap. Okay, so they go to Oberlin and they just didn't get let into this party because Oberlin was too snobby and they thought that they were just randos passing through town, but really it was Sleater-Kinney and the White Stripes. And she was not even for herself. She was I wonder if that kid ever realizes that he slammed the door in Jack White's face and said there was not enough cups for us.
In 2000, Corinne called to tell me that she would need to take time off from the band. She was pregnant. I went into a momentary state of panic. What would I do without Sleater-Kinney? But also, who was I without this band?
So she becomes a substitute teacher.
Do you think when I get pregnant, you're going to become a sub?
No.
Okay.
I don't. I think we're going to reevaluate the company policy and find out we actually have no maternity leave.
It's tough, but it's America. I actually owe the company money. I'll be fined for my disobedience, my insubordination. Anyway, so what is she going to do now? She's should I go back to school? She goes, all I had was a bachelor's degree and 5 albums. So she ends up becoming a sub. And when she wasn't teaching, she acted in one of Miranda July's experimental short films.
She just stays busy as fuck. She's very afraid of stillness.
She also gets sick of Olympia. She's I'm so sick of you losers screaming that you don't care. Which is, I get that. Sometimes you're just yeah, the people who care least aren't the ones screaming about how little they care.
Yeah, she tries to participate in this women's music festival in Olympia, but then they're mad that Carrie from Sleater-Kinney being part of it is getting press.
She has to apologize for the fact that her band is more successful than everybody else's band. And also she's nothing could get done because nobody wanted to be the leader because it was supposed to be this egalitarian communist bullshit. And she's I know, we would just sit in these meetings where everybody would be well, does anybody have any ideas? And you weren't allowed to have an idea. I'm ugh, ladies. I never wanted to feel ashamed for striving, for desiring, for ambition, and I never wanted to judge another woman or anyone for that matter for their own aspirations, even if they differed from my own.
So then she moves to Portland.
It was the first time they all lived in the same city.
And she like references 9/11 a bunch.
She says this sentence, which is actually up there with the all-time top 50 delusional 9/11 celebrity sentences. It's hard to pick one. Here's the number one indicator of how famous you will be. It is like the combination of how much you thought 9/11 was about you and how far you were from 9/11. So she was in Portland and she said, I moved to an apartment in Southeast Portland, fresh from being cheated on and a subsequent breakup, and in the post-9/11 mindset where all the structures you felt like you could count on now seem tenuous. Imagine watching the footage of 9/11 that morning and going, this is so much like when I got cheated on.
A breakup and now this?
Okay, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. I thought that girl couldn't take down my love. The steel beams of our relationship.
A conspiracy is afoot.
I heard it was George Bush both times. Imagine being like, George Bush flew a plane into the World Trade Center and he ate my girlfriend's pussy.
Damn
The Hague. Try him at The Hague.
So she moves to Portland. They record another album. I will say, I don't know when the break could have been because they're recording an album and Corin is pregnant. And then they're like touring and Corin has a new baby. I don't know. It's kind of confusing about the timeline.
And then also they were writing songs after 9/11, which felt treacherous. If there's anything that 9/11 hit the hardest, it was punk bands from the Northwest.
To their credit, they were writing anti-war.
Not yet. Not till 2003.
Oh.
She's like, at first, nobody wanted to say anything. And then the Dixie Chicks went down. But by 2003, she's like, people were kind of sensing that something was up.
So on stage, it was like a little bit less freaky because the Dixie Chicks had already gone down. Sorry, the Chicks.
You know how they were on tour before? They're still on tour. It's 2002 and they're still on tour.
They're just always on tour.
Then they open for
Pearl Jam.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God. And she also goes on this whole rant against loser boys, which I fucking love.
She hates slacker rock.
Beck, Stephen Malkmus of Pavement, Rivers Cuomo of Weezer. I guess you love slacker rock because those are the guys you'd fuck tomorrow, no?
I wouldn't fuck any of them, but I would let them stay at my house and maybe kiss. Okay, here's the thing that I want to say about slacker rock, old school, and slacker rock, new school, because Pavement and Weezer are still like touring hard.
We saw them just this summer.
There is this like perception of slacker rock that I actually think we see with comedy all the time. There's like this slacker comedy, people who seem like they're not working hard and they have this like air of, I didn't even try hard, I just ended up here, when really there's like so much work and preparation that went into it. So I actually won't admonish these bands as slackers because I actually think if you look at like the number of albums that, I'm not a big fan of Beck, but like that Pavement and Weezer have put out specifically, I'm like, well, when were they slacking? If like some of their albums aren't good, but like there's a lot of them. But I will say people see that and they go, oh, well, I can just fuck around and like shit out some crap and be a slacker rock band. And it's like, no, they're not actually slacking. There's like a vibe of slacking, which I agree with her when she says no woman can give off a vibe of slacking.
That's not true. Then how was Lana Del Rey so successful after her SNL? They made it look casual, like the stakes were low or non-existent. I admired and listened to the music, and I think the perception and reception were different from their intent. But I also thought about what a privilege it must be to feel or to affect that entitlement, to be on stage, to play music, to get up in front of people and appear to not care. Entitlement is a precarious place from which to create or perform. It projects the idea that you have nothing to prove, nothing to claim, nothing to show but self-satisfaction, a smug boredom. It breeds ambivalence. It's as if instead of having to prove that they are something, these musicians prove that they aren't anything. It's an inverted dynamic, one that sets performers up to fail, but also gives them a false sense of having already arrived. I don't understand how someone could not push, challenge, or at least present. How anyone could get on stage and not give everything. I feel the same way.
I guess I feel that her anger is like a little bit misplaced at them. I think she just like doesn't like that type of music. Do you know what I mean? Like the idea that they're not getting on stage and giving everything. I don't know, up to whose perception. Like that people just perform in different ways. The idea that like they're pushing the idea of not showing up for your show. Like, I guess I don't know how they were performing then, but as someone who's seen both of these bands live in the last 6 months, I wouldn't say in any way that they give nothing on stage. I think they give a lot. And so I think they just are pushing two different narratives, and she like doesn't really like what they're doing.
I think like Nate Bargatze is an example of a comedian who seems like mumblecore-esque, where he's just getting up there, and he is, to me, one of the best working comedians out there right now. On the other hand, I once watched a comedian storm off stage at the stand because two people were talking in the front row. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of your job, dude, to like push through or to get them to stop talking. I mean, I really have no respect for people who don't think it's their job to make an audience laugh.
Oh, I agree. But I think that this idea, like this self-satisfaction, this smug boredom breeds ambivalence. I'm like, okay, well then what does screaming rock breed? Like violence and anger. Do you know what I mean? Like this idea that the bands on stage are responsible for like making everyone else suck. I'm just like, I don't know. Every band has a quality that you could look at and go, oh, well, that type of music is bad for people to listen to because it breeds X negative quality.
Mm-hmm. So then they start touring with Pearl Jam, and she's like embarrassed about it because Pearl Jam's fucking losers. And she's like, ugh, we're doing these stadium tours with these guys. And like, it's crazy because yesterday we were sleeping on a couch and now we're pulling up to stadiums where professional athletes play. And she's like, you know what, though? I listen to some of their music and they're actually pretty good. And Eddie Vedder, every time he talks to me, says I'm like his Mick Jagger. And he thinks that we're like as great as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and that he thinks what we're doing is incredible. And he's never been sexist to me. And he just like respects my music and gives me opportunities to play consistently.
I mean, he shows up constantly. He invites them to open for Pearl Jam. He shows up to their final show before they took a really long hiatus. Like, Eddie Vedder is a top-ranking supporter.
She was like, I was embarrassed to be seen with him because he's so popular, and that's humiliating. But it turns out he got popular because he's really good at music. They're like, this is the problem with those insular fucking sellout fear. Like, sometimes I'm like, I don't know, man. Sometimes a million people can be wrong, but also sometimes a million people are right.
The thing is, she like rails against the exclusivity of punk scenes, but then she has so much. And I get it. It's hard to unlearn. Like, we have this so bad with comedy.
I don't like hate her for it because
I don't hate her for it.
But she fully is acknowledged. Like, that's what this whole passage is about, is her saying, I went in thinking I was better than Pearl Jam because I was less successful than Pearl Jam. And then I watched them and I realized how stupid I was. It is so funny, though, to be like, if you're not mosh pitting, your music sucks. Like,
it's so funny because people were moshing at Weezer.
But also just think about all the kinds of music where people sit quietly and listen.
Yeah.
Nobody is giving everything unless you're about to throw your fucking amp at someone.
I mean, that's the thing, is she's like, this music, they're not even trying that hard. Meanwhile, she was like, got in trouble a couple times for like chucking her mic stand into the audience. I'm just like, I don't know. If I was thinking about which one I would prefer, like a concert where I might get concussed versus a concert where I could have a really fun time.
So then they write their final album together, The Woods.
They join a new label, Sub Pop.
They get a new PR person. They just shake it all up. And she had been like trying different things on for size. She thought about getting her MFA. She moves to the Bay Area. She hates it. She writes a song about trying to commit suicide, not her, but others, called about the Golden Gate Bridge, called Jumpers.
Corinne is a mom and just like doesn't care as much. Like, she's not putting as much into the band, and there's a lot of tension.
So now they're putting out this album, but they're going to tour less because she's like, I want to go home and be with my kids.
And they like get that and they're happy about it, but they also are just like, okay, you need to record this track harder.
A music career, especially for women, is so at odds with the assumed normative path towards maturity and aging. So they end up doing this kind of abbreviated tour. And they get out there, and guess who fucks it up anyway? Carrie. She gets shingles like a bitch.
No, this is when she gets an allergic reaction like a bitch.
First, she keeps getting allergic to stuff, and then she starts having panic attacks. And then one day she has shingles, and it turns out Jenny had never had childhood
chickenpox.
So it's super contagious. And I think chickenpox is actually quite deadly for adults. So everybody's like pissed. She's pissed because she has shingles. Jenny's pissed because she could die. And they just call it. So they go home and they end up doing 2 goodbye shows in Portland. And they're like, well, I guess that's that.
You skipped the part where she's like... Oh,
sorry. I forgot that she actually ends up punching herself in the face a bunch. And everybody's like, you have to stop doing that.
She thinks this is why they ended up calling it. She's like, I had shingles and I like couldn't stop punching myself in the face because I was so mad at myself. And then they were like, yeah, we can't really do this band anymore.
But they also still did like another week of shows. They couldn't cancel the rest of the shows. So they finished out the European leg of the tour with her just like bloodied and covered in shingles. And then they go home and they're like, so we should take a break, right?
No one trusted me. The band gave me my own hotel room so that I could sleep, so that I could lie in bed and talk to my dad. I knew I wanted to stop. I was done. I had dragged Sleater-Kinney into oblivion, a place where we used to get with our music. I took us there with hurt. It feels like it comes on really suddenly.
No, it doesn't. She had been like getting sicker and sicker and sicker every tour.
I feel like she like always loved the music. And then all of a sudden with this record, I think she was like in partnership with Corin. And then when Corin didn't care that much, she was like, okay, actually, I'm going to go fucking off the rails.
Anyway, so then they call indefinite hiatus, and she starts working at a shelter where she gets addicted to like adopting dogs and cats. And then one day, one of her dogs eats her cat, and she's like, well, now I can't handle anything.
It made me so sad. So then the book ends with her at Lance and Corin's house.
This is the epilogue, though. I mean, the book literally just ends with her being like, my dog's dead. I have nothing.
No, her cat.
Her cat's dead. But in a way,
emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to love your dog after he's killed your cat. And she's just like, and I thought I had nothing when I lost the band, but now I have nothing. And then it just epilogues. And she's like, anyway, me and Fred Armisen are working on our TV show. And I'm like, what? That's the epilogue?
This comes out years after Portlandia came out. It just like wasn't important for the book. And then she's showing the show to Corin. And then they discuss maybe playing some songs together again. And then in 2015, they come out with an album.
I have a suspicion. What if this epilogue was written like epilogue-ish, like actually as a postscript, and she's writing the memoir of Sleater-Kinney while she was working on Portlandia.
Yeah.
And she realized she missed it, and she reached out, and then she got to be like, happy ending. We're back.
I bet you they stayed friends.
Do you think it's a coincidence that this book came out the year that Sleater-Kinney came back?
I don't think it's a coincidence at all.
She has a lot of fingers in a lot of jars of cookies. She's a musician. She's an actress. She's a writer.
I understand that this was like a memoir of Sleater-Kinney, but I would like to hear about how this hiatus where she spent a year as like the Portland dog assistant of the year, whenever she got named, she like won an award for volunteering too hard. I want to know how that got her into conversation with Fred Armisen about like a sketch comedy show.
Carrie, there's more to be told. This is a really good book.
Yeah.
There's an ounce of in the weeds about it, but I still think that it's mostly about if you've ever been part of a niche, if you've ever been a fan, if you've ever felt compelled, if you've ever had a young friendship that went off the rails because you guys felt too much, if you've ever punched yourself in the face and looked back and been like, that was crazy. I mean, if you've ever been 21 with the opportunity of a lifetime and instead sat at a Panera and eat a fucking bread bowl, you've been where Carrie's been. Who among us hasn't done that?
Do you know what else is interesting is that she does talk about how Sleater-Kinney was like just too intense for anyone to understand, like to ever go mainstream. But she also like refused to go mainstream. She ate a bread bowl instead of going to the big meetings.
I don't mean to be diminutive here, but nothing is crazier than looking at the fucking photos of these. Like, they're just kids.
Yeah.
Like, I guess because this is back in the day before they knew about filler. But they really do look 22, 23. And it's so crazy to look at these girls and think these just kids were out there like fucking breaking necks on tour and doing the freakiest rock shit. They were just little babies. I can't believe they're even allowed to drive. They look like young kids. Anyway, go out there, be cool. How fertile is this soil?
I would say 4.5 out of 5.
That's exactly what I would say.
Wow. How many wormtinis would you have?
17. I'd go on tour with this bitch.
I would love to. If you're ever thinking about writing another sketch comedy show, Carrie Brownstein, I'd love to collab.
Not me. I hate sketch comedy, but I'll definitely be at the after party.
And thank you to our wormies, our 5-star reviewing wormies. I would love to scream sing praises at you.